Every morning he climbed that mountain. No matter the weather, no matter the pain, he never missed a day. But when a trail camera finally revealed why he did it, the entire town was left in tears. Would you have the strength to keep going if the person you loved the most never made it home? Let us know in the comments section below. Ethan Carter grunted as he tightened the straps on his prosthetic legs, a routine that had long since become muscle memory. The titanium limbs locked into place, the familiar click echoing in the quiet of his modest cabin. He adjusted his backpack, ensuring the small metal was safely tucked inside. Every morning, without fail, he climbed that mountain, and today was no different. The small town of Jackson Ridge had long since noticed the lone figure making his way up the winding trails at sunrise. At first it had been a curiosity, whispered about in grocery stores and diners. Some thought he was training for something, others assumed it was a form of therapy. No one had the nerve to ask him directly. Ethan had never been one for explanations. He wasn't rude, just distant. A man who carried the weight of a world no one else could see. When people asked polite questions at the gas station or the hardware store, he'd offer a nod or a simple yep, but never more than that. The truth wasn't theirs to carry. His ascent was slow but steady, the mechanical hiss of his prosthetics blending with the rustling leaves. He had learned to move with the terrain, adjusting his balance to compensate for the lack of sensation in his artificial legs. Every step was precise. A few hikers crossed his path occasionally, their expressions shifting from surprise to admiration when they realized the man before them was a double amputee tackling a trail that even the able-bodied found challenging. They would offer words of encouragement, "That's amazing, man," or "Keep going, you're an inspiration." Ethan would nod, but their words passed through him like wind through the trees. Inspiration wasn't why he did this. Near the base of the trail, Daniel Murphy, a park ranger, leaned against his truck, watching as Ethan passed. He'd seen him do this dozens of times, always alone, never stopping to talk. Something about it gnawed at him. Why was he doing this every single day? And more importantly, why did he never waver? The town might have been satisfied with their theories, but Daniel wasn't. He had seen grief before. He had seen how it changed people, how it made them run, freeze, or drown. Ethan wasn't running. Climbing with a purpose no one could understand. That night, after another day of watching Ethan disappear into the trees, Daniel made a decision. He was going to find out why, and the only way to do that was to set up a trail camera. Whispers about Ethan Carter's daily mountain climb spread through Jackson Ridge like wildfire. The small town, where everyone knew everyone, wasn't used to unanswered questions, and Ethan, he was the biggest one they'd had in years. At Mel's diner, over plates of eggs and toast, conversations always circled back to him. "Saw him again this morning," old Joe Tate muttered, stirring his coffee. "Man's got legs made of metal and still climbs higher than any of us." "I heard he used to be a Marine," said Carla, the waitress, refilling cups. "Lost his legs in Afghanistan or Iraq, I ain't sure which." Pete, the town barber, shook his head. "Doesn't explain why he does it. A man like that, he's got nothing to prove." Theories ranged from training for a competition to simply being unable to sit still. Some thought it was therapy, his own way of fighting off demons they'd never understand. A few even joked that he had buried something up there, something he wasn't willing to let go of. But no one had an answer, and that made people uneasy. Park Ranger Daniel Murphy had been listening to these conversations for weeks now. He'd seen Ethan climbing firsthand, felt the weight of those unanswered questions himself. But what got to him the most was how consistent Ethan was. Rain, wind, cold, it didn't matter. The man climbed like his life depended on it. One evening, Daniel sat on his porch, staring at the mountain that loomed in the distance. He ran a hand over his beard, thinking. There had to be a reason. Ethan wasn't the type to just do things for the sake of it. He had a mission, a purpose, and Daniel wanted to understand what it was. He considered asking him directly, but something told him that would only push Ethan further into silence. The man wasn't a talker, at least not about himself, which meant Daniel needed another approach. That's when the idea struck him. Trail cameras. The Park Service used them all the time to track wildlife: bears, deer, the occasional cougar. If he placed one on the summit, he could finally see what Ethan did when he reached the top. Maybe it would answer the question the entire town had been asking. Or maybe, Daniel thought, it would reveal something even deeper. Daniel Murphy wasn't the type to let things go easily. He had spent years as a park ranger, learning the patterns of the land, tracking wildlife, and understanding human nature just as much as he did the animals that roamed Jackson Ridge. But Ethan Carter, he was a different kind of mystery. By the time the idea of using a trail camera settled in Daniel's mind, he knew he had already committed to it. That's how it always was. Once a thought took hold, it didn't let go until he had his answers. The following morning, long before sunrise, Daniel packed a high-resolution motion-activated camera into his truck. The camera was designed to capture anything that moved, day or night, rain or shine. Normally, he used it to track bear activity near campgrounds. Today, it had a new purpose. By the time he reached the base of the trail, Ethan was already halfway up. Daniel watched from a distance, leaning against his truck. The veteran's climb was slow, methodical, no wasted movements, no hesitation. His body, even with its prosthetic legs, moved with a rhythm that spoke of discipline and habit. Daniel wasn't sure why, but something about it made his chest tighten. He gave Ethan a good head start before shouldering his backpack and setting off. He wasn't following him, not exactly, but he needed to find a place near the summit to install the camera before Ethan made his way back down. The climb was harder than he remembered. Daniel had taken this trail dozens of times, but now, with every step, he found himself thinking about how much harder it had to be for Ethan. And yet the man did it every day. By the time Daniel reached the summit, sweat clung to his back despite the morning chill. He found a sturdy pine tree overlooking the clearing where Ethan always stopped. It was the perfect vantage point, hidden but with a clear view. With practiced hands, he secured the camera, testing its angle. The small red light blinked, indicating it was live. Every movement in this area would be recorded. Now all that was left to do was wait. Daniel crouched behind a rock just as he heard the steady, deliberate footsteps of Ethan approaching. He stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe as Ethan reached the summit. From his hiding place, Daniel watched as Ethan stood there, unmoving for a long moment. Then, with slow, practiced motions, the veteran unzipped his backpack and pulled something out. A small, glinting object. A medal. Ethan knelt before a modest stack of stones, something Daniel hadn't noticed before, a makeshift memorial. The ranger's breath hitched as Ethan placed the medal carefully on the stones, then bowed his head. His lips moved, though no sound carried in the breeze. Daniel didn't need to hear what he was saying. He already knew it was something important, something deeply personal. And suddenly, he wasn't sure if he had the right to be watching at all. The footage sat untouched for 2 days. Daniel Murphy wasn't sure why he hesitated. Maybe it was guilt, like he had stolen something private, or maybe he just wasn't ready to see whatever truth the camera had caught. But the town's curiosity was growing. Every day more people asked about Ethan Carter, wondering what drove him to climb that mountain again and again. Theories piled up in whispered conversations at the diner, at the hardware store, even in the town's bar. Daniel had the answer. He just hadn't looked at it yet. On the 3rd morning, he sat in his office at the ranger station, laptop open, memory card in hand. With a slow breath, he slid it into the reader and pressed play. At first, the video was nothing unusual. Trees swayed in the wind. A hawk soared overhead. The occasional rustle of wildlife moving through the underbrush. Then, at the 47-minute mark, the frame captured a figure emerging from the tree line. Ethan. Daniel leaned forward, eyes locked on the screen. The veteran walked with the same steady pace he always did, his prosthetic legs moving with an ease that only came from years of practice. He didn't stop to take in the view, didn't pause to rest, just headed straight for the small, hidden pile of stones near the summit. Then he dropped to one knee. Daniel's breath caught. Ethan reached into his backpack and pulled something out. A small, glinting object. The camera's lens adjusted. focusing just enough for Daniel to recognize what it was. A medal. Ethan placed it carefully on the stack of stones. For several seconds he didn't move, just stared at the tiny memorial like it held the weight of the world. Then, slowly, he bowed his head. His lips moved, whispering something too quiet for the camera to pick up. But even without sound, Daniel knew what it was. A name, a prayer, a promise. Ethan stayed there, motionless, for a long time. The wind shifted, rustling the leaves around him, but he never wavered. It was only when the sun began to dip lower in the sky that he finally rose, adjusting his backpack and turning back toward the trail. And then, just before leaving, he did something that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. He looked up at the sky. Not just a glance, but something more. A silent message, a farewell. The video ended. Daniel sat frozen, staring at the screen. The footage was heartbreaking. It was raw. And suddenly he understood why Ethan Carter climbed that mountain every single day. Daniel Murphy sat staring at his laptop screen long after the video ended. The weight of what he had seen pressed heavy on his chest, a knot forming in his throat. He had expected to satisfy his curiosity, to uncover some simple, logical reason for Ethan Carter's relentless climbs. Instead, he had found something raw, something deeply human. And now he had a choice. He could keep this to himself, pretend like he had never set up that camera, and let Ethan continue his ritual in peace. Or he could share it. Daniel hesitated. It wasn't his story to tell. It wasn't his grief to expose. But something about the footage, about the way Ethan kneeled, the way he placed that medal so carefully, the way he looked up to the sky like he was speaking to someone who wasn't there, it felt bigger than just one man's private sorrow. It felt like something the world needed to see. With a deep breath, he reached for his phone. That evening, as the sun set over Jackson Ridge, the video was quietly uploaded to a small veterans forum. No title, no explanation, just raw footage of a man climbing a mountain and honoring something unseen. Within hours, it started to spread. At first, it was just a handful of veterans commenting, men and women who recognized the weight of what Ethan was doing, who saw in him the echoes of their own lost brothers and sisters. Then the video made its way onto social media, shared by someone who had no connection to Jackson Ridge, but who felt something when they watched it. By morning, it had gone viral. Mel's Diner was packed that day, everyone glued to their phones, murmuring in disbelief. "Have you seen this?" Carla, the waitress, gasped, holding up her phone. "It's Ethan. It's him." 2 million views, Pete muttered, adjusting his glasses. Overnight, the town, once filled with speculation and whispered theories, now sat in stunned silence. People who had passed Ethan every morning without a second thought were suddenly looking at him differently, not as some mystery to be solved, but as a man carrying a weight too heavy to bear alone. And Ethan? He had no idea. He was already back on the mountain, just as he had been every morning before, unaware that the world was now watching, unaware that soon everything was about to change. Ethan Carter didn't own a smartphone. The old flip phone he carried had no internet, no notifications, no connection to the world beyond Jackson Ridge. He didn't need it. His days were simple. Wake up, strap on his prosthetics, climb the mountain, come home. Repeat. So when he walked into Mel's Diner that morning for his usual black coffee and eggs, he didn't understand why everything felt different. The room quieted the moment he stepped inside. Conversations that had been lively just seconds before faded to hushed murmurs. People glanced at him, some avoiding eye contact, others staring with open curiosity, even admiration. He ignored it. He had learned long ago not to pay attention to how people looked at him. Some pitied him, some respected him, some just didn't know what to say. It didn't matter. Carla, the waitress, approached his table slower than usual, her hands gripping the coffee pot a little tighter. She poured him a cup, then hesitated. "Ethan," she started. He looked up, waiting. She exhaled. "You seen the video?" His brow furrowed. "What video?" Carla blinked. "Oh, you really don't know, do you?" Before he could answer, the bell above the diner's door jingled. A man in a pressed blue shirt and slacks stepped inside, scanning the room until his eyes locked onto Ethan. He knew that look. Charnless. "Mr. Carter," the man said, approaching with an extended hand. "John Fisher, from the National Herald?" Ethan didn't shake his hand. John hesitated, then continued, undeterred. "I was hoping to talk to you about the video, the one of you climbing the mountain." Ethan's grip tightened around his coffee mug. He didn't like where this was going. "I don't know what you're talking about." John glanced around, suddenly realizing that everyone in the diner was listening. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and turned it toward Ethan. The video played. Ethan watched himself on the tiny screen, kneeling at the summit, placing the medal, whispering words no one else could hear. His stomach dropped. I. His voice was low, steady, but beneath it was a brewing storm. "Where did you get this?" John hesitated. "It was posted online. A lot of people have seen it. They're moved by what you do. People are calling you an inspiration." Ethan didn't want to be an inspiration. He pushed back his chair and stood, jaw clenched. "I don't want to talk. Mr. Carter, wait." Ethan was already heading for the door, his steps faster than usual, his mind racing. How had this happened? And more importantly, who had done it? The door to Mel's diner slammed shut behind Ethan, but he barely heard it. His pulse pounded in his ears, his breath coming quicker than it should, not from exertion. He had climbed mountains with more effort, but from the sharp sting of betrayal. Someone had filmed him. Someone had taken something private, sacred, and put it out for the world to see. He marched down Main Street, his prosthetic legs clanking a little harder than usual against the pavement. He knew exactly where he was going. The ranger station. By the time he reached the wooden building, Daniel Murphy was already stepping onto the porch, as if expecting him. His expression was unreadable, but Ethan didn't care. "You did this?" Ethan said, voice tight. Daniel sighed, crossing his arms. "I put up the camera, yes." Ethan's fists clenched. "Why?" Daniel met his glare head-on. "Because people wanted to know, and maybe, just maybe, you shouldn't have to do this alone." "I wasn't alone," Ethan growled. "Not until you turned me into some damn spectacle." Daniel let that hang between them. Then he spoke, softer this time. "Did you even watch the comments?" Ethan shook his head. He didn't care about what strangers had to say. Daniel stepped aside, opening the door to the ranger station. "Come inside." For a long moment, Ethan stood there, unmoving. But finally, with a huff, he stepped in. Daniel walked over to his desk, turned his computer monitor toward Ethan, and hit play. The video was there, again, but this time Ethan wasn't watching himself. He was watching the words below. Thousands of them. Arrived. "I lost my brother in Iraq. I think about him every day. Thank you for this. This man doesn't even know me, but he's carrying the same grief I do. My dad was a Marine. He never talked about it, but I wish he had. This made me cry. We see you, Ethan. We hear you." Ethan swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he reached for the mouse, scrolling through the endless flood of responses. Some were from veterans, some from family members, some from complete strangers who just understood. And then the most recent one, "If he's still climbing, then we should climb with him." Ethan's breath caught. He looked at Daniel, who gave a small, knowing nod. "The town's organizing something," Daniel said. "A final climb, with you, if you'll let us." Ethan turned back to the screen. For the first time in a long, long while, he didn't feel alone. Ethan Carter wasn't sure how to feel. He had spent years climbing that mountain alone, carrying the weight of loss in silence. Now, the entire town wanted to join him for one final climb. They called it an honor. They called it inspirational. But Ethan wasn't sure if he was ready for any of it. For the first time in a long time, doubt crept in. Sitting in his cabin, he stared at his prosthetic legs, the same ones that had carried him up that trail every morning without fail. They weren't in great shape. The carbon fiber was scratched and worn, the mechanisms stiff from the cold. Climbing had always been a struggle, but now, with the entire town watching, it felt impossible. And yet, the climb itself wasn't what scared him the most. It was the idea of letting other people into his grief. For years it had been his ritual, his way of keeping his son's memory alive. Letting others in felt like giving a piece of it away. A sharp knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Ethan exhaled and pulled himself up, wincing as he adjusted his legs. The phantom pain never really went away. When he opened the door, Daniel Murphy stood on the porch. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a man Ethan hadn't seen in years. "Sergeant Reynolds," Ethan muttered, surprised. "Damn right," Reynolds said, stepping forward. "But you can just call me Charlie now." Ethan didn't know what to say. Charlie had been one of his closest friends in the Marines, one of the only men who truly understood the weight of losing people you cared about. He had been at Noah's funeral, but after that they had drifted apart, as so many veterans did. Charlie clapped him on the shoulder. "I saw the video, brother. Took the first flight out." Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. "You flew all the way here for a damn hike?" "Nah," Charlie said. "I flew out here for you." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. "You don't have to do this alone, man," Charlie continued. "Not anymore." Ethan swallowed hard, looking past Charlie at the quiet forest beyond. For the first time, he let the truth sink in. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't climbing for just himself anymore. The mountain looked different today. Ethan Carter had climbed it every morning for years, through wind, rain, and blistering heat, but today felt heavier. Not because of the weight of his backpack or the ache in his prosthetic legs, but because of the people. Hundreds of them. They gathered at the base of the trail just before sunrise. Locals, veterans, strangers who had driven from miles away after seeing the video. Some wore military caps, others clutched photos of loved ones they had lost. The air buzzed with quiet anticipation, but no one spoke above a whisper. It was as if they all knew this wasn't just a hike. It was something more. Ethan stood near the trailhead, adjusting the straps on his backpack, when Charlie Reynolds walked up beside him. "You ready for this?" Charlie asked. Ethan let out a slow breath. "No." Charlie smirked. "Good. That means it's worth doing." The crowd parted as Ethan stepped forward, leading the way. His legs felt heavier than usual, the climb steeper than it had ever been. He was used to the silence of these early mornings, but today every step carried the weight of those who followed. A few feet behind him, an elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap hiked with slow determination, his grandson steadying him on the uneven path. A young woman wiped her eyes as she climbed, a folded flag tucked against her chest. Ethan kept moving. With every step, the mountain became something different. It was no longer just a place for his grief. It was a place for theirs, too. Halfway up, his legs burned. Sweat dripped down his back. His breaths came heavier than they should have. But when he looked back, he saw something that made his throat tighten. They weren't just following him. They were carrying each other. A man with a prosthetic leg similar to Ethan's had his arm wrapped around another veteran's shoulder, helping him forward. A teenage boy carried his father's rucksack, too big for his own frame, but determined to bear its weight. For the first time, Ethan understood. This wasn't just his climb anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever lost someone. It belonged to every soldier who never made it home. By the time they reached the summit, the sun was just beginning to rise. Ethan took one final step forward and turned to face them all. No one spoke. No one had to. They had all made it. Together, Ethan Carter stood at the summit, the crisp morning air biting at his skin, but he barely felt it. His prosthetic legs ached, his muscles burned, but none of it mattered. He had climbed this mountain more times than he could count, but today, this climb was different. He wasn't alone. Behind him, hundreds of people had made the journey, standing shoulder to shoulder. Veterans, families of fallen soldiers, locals who had known him for years, and strangers who had only heard his story a few days ago. Some held flags, some wiped away silent tears, but no one spoke. The weight of the moment was too sacred for words. Ethan reached into his backpack, his fingers closing around the small, familiar object. He pulled it out slowly, letting the morning light catch the silver medal, the same one he had placed here every single day. He lowered himself carefully onto one knee, placing the medal on the small, weathered pile of stones. His son's memorial. His hands lingered over it longer this time. His throat tightened. For years this had been his ritual, his silent way of speaking to Noah, of keeping the promise they had made so long ago. But today, as he bowed his head, he realized something. This promise wasn't just his anymore. A hand landed gently on his shoulder. He looked up to see Charlie standing beside him, his expression solemn. Ethan turned his gaze to the crowd behind them. Faces full of grief, of understanding, of quiet respect. He had spent so long carrying this alone. He didn't have to anymore. Ethan swallowed, drawing in a shaky breath before lifting his eyes to the sky. The wind rushed over the summit, crisp and clean, filling his lungs, lifting something inside him that he hadn't felt in years. Peace. He reached out, brushing his fingers over the medal one last time. Then, finally, he let go. The mountain had carried his grief for long enough. It was time to climb down. Together, the silence at the summit lingered, heavy but not burdensome. It was the kind of silence that said more than words ever could, the kind that carried grief, healing, and a quiet sense of understanding. Ethan Carter had spent years climbing this mountain alone, burdened by a promise made to a son who never came home. But as he looked out over the landscape below, he realized something for the first time. He wasn't carrying this weight alone anymore. The people standing behind him, men and women of all ages, each with their own scars, their own losses, their own stories. They understood they weren't here just for him. They were here because they carried their own burdens, their own unspoken grief. And just like him, they had spent years shouldering it in silence. No one told them how to come back from war. No one told them how to live when others didn't make it home. But today, on this mountain, they had found something. Each other. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the crisp morning air fill his lungs. He had placed that medal on the memorial so many times, whispering the same words, making the same promise, but for the first time he felt the weight of it lift, as if Noah had finally heard him, as if he was finally at peace. The first step down the mountain was the hardest, not because of exhaustion or pain, but because of what it meant. It meant moving forward. It meant accepting that grief didn't have to be carried in solitude. It meant that maybe, just maybe, he had been climbing all this time not because he was keeping a promise, but because he hadn't known how to let go. But he wasn't letting go of his son. No, he was letting go of the guilt, the feeling that he had to do this alone. The descent was slower than the climb. People moved carefully, making sure those who needed help had it. Ethan wasn't used to that, to people offering support without asking for anything in return. But when Charlie placed a steadying hand on his back, when a woman he had never met before took his arm to help him over a steep rock, he didn't resist. For the first time in years, he let someone else share the weight. By the time they reached the base, the sun had fully risen, casting warm light over Jackson Ridge. The quiet murmurs grew into something louder, a buzz of conversation, of relief, of people realizing what they had just done together. No one rushed off. No one acted like this was just another morning. Because it wasn't. It was something bigger. A local news reporter hesitated on the sidelines, microphone in hand, waiting to see if Ethan would say something. He had ignored every request for an interview up to this point. He had no interest in fame, in being a symbol, in people calling him an inspiration. But now, maybe, just this once. Ethan took a step forward, turning to face the crowd. He cleared his throat, his voice rough from exhaustion. "I don't have a lot to say," he admitted, his eyes scanning the faces in front of him. "But I guess I don't need to. You all know why you're here. You all have someone you lost, someone you wish was still here. I climb this mountain every day for my son." He paused, exhaling. "But today?" "I climbed it for all of them." A heavy silence followed, then, slowly, applause. Not the kind of applause meant for heroes or celebrities, but the kind meant for understanding, the kind meant for people who saw themselves in his words, in his grief, in his struggle. Ethan stepped back, his gaze turning toward the mountain one last time. He had spent so long climbing, thinking he was chasing something. Closure, maybe? Or redemption? But today, for the first time, he realized he wasn't climbing to hold on. He had been climbing to find his way back, and now he finally had. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Ethan Carter didn't think about tomorrow's climb. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure if there would be one. And for the first time in years, he was okay with that.